Then from the back, a young employee stepped forward. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, his name tag barely hanging on. He swallowed hard before speaking. "I heard him," he said, nodding toward the manager. Before he called the cops, he said, "Watch her. She looks like trouble." A hushed gasp ran through the crowd. The manager's face darkened. "That's not true," he blurted out, too quickly. But the damage was done. Chief Daniels tilted her head, studying him. "So you judged me before I even spoke. Before I even had a chance." Her words were measured, but the weight behind them was undeniable. The young employee stepped forward again. "That's not all," he added hesitantly. "After you were handcuffed," he laughed. A sharp inhale swept through the onlookers. The room suddenly felt too small, too exposed. The truth wasn't just coming out, it was unraveling faster than anyone could control. The manager's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Chief Daniels exhaled slowly, then turned to the officers. "And you. Did you ever stop to question why you were really called?" Silence. Thick, suffocating silence. Then, just when it seemed like the tension couldn't climb any higher, the store doors swung open. A new presence entered the room. Someone powerful. Someone who could change everything. And just like that, the night wasn't over. It was only beginning. The store doors swung open with force, and in walked a tall, commanding figure in a crisp suit. His sharp gaze swept the room, instantly demanding attention. The officers stiffened, recognizing him immediately. Deputy Commissioner Reynolds. His eyes landed on Chief Daniels, then flicked to the manager and the officers. "I got a call," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Seems we have a situation." The manager opened his mouth, but Reynolds held up a hand. "No, I don't want excuses." He turned to the officers. "You arrested your own chief. Without cause. Without asking questions. Do you have anything to say for yourselves?" One officer cleared his throat. We thought." "That was your mistake," Chief Daniels cut in, her voice unwavering. "You thought instead of asking. You assumed instead of investigating. That's not how we do this job." The weight of her words hung in the air. The officers looked down, their shame evident. The crowd watched, waiting for what would come next. Then, just when it seemed like the story had reached its peak, Reynolds turned back to the manager. "And you," he said coldly. "This isn't the first complaint we've had about you." The manager's face drained of color. "We'll be launching a full investigation into your hiring practices and past incidents," Reynolds continued. "And I strongly suggest you start looking for a new job." A murmur ran through the crowd. The young employee who had spoken earlier let out a breath of relief. Chief Daniels finally took a step forward, unlocking her gaze from the manager. But just as the tension began to ease, a voice from the back of the store spoke up again. "What about the others?" The judge's face drained of color. The prosecutor's hands shook. "That's impossible," he stammered. "Eleanor Graves is." "Gone?" The woman raised an eyebrow. "Funny. That's exactly what they wanted everyone to believe." A tense silence fell over the room. But before anyone could react, the back doors slammed open again. This time, uniformed officers entered. And the moment their eyes met Eleanor's, she knew. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The courtroom held its breath as the officers marched in, their faces unreadable. Eleanor remained still, watching them carefully. The judge, struggling to regain his composure, banged his gavel. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. One of the officers stepped forward, pulling out a file. "We received an urgent request to unseal classified documents related to Harrison v. State *," he announced. "It appears there was tampering." Gasps echoed through the room. Eleanor folded her hands, her expression unreadable. Tampering? The prosecutor choked out. The officer nodded. Evidence was buried. Testimonies were altered, and the one responsible for it. He turned to the judge. Was sitting on this bench the entire time. The courtroom erupted. The judge's face twisted in panic. "That's absurd," he shouted. But his voice cracked under the weight of the truth. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "You tried to erase me," she said, meeting his eyes. "But justice has a way of finding its way back." The officers moved toward the bench. The judge's hands trembled as reality sank in. The man in the dark suit, an investigative attorney, placed a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "Looks like you're not the one on trial after all." As the judge was led away, Eleanor turned to the stunned courtroom. "Shall we proceed with my case now?" she asked, a sly smile forming. The silence that followed was not of disbelief, but of awe. The tension in the courtroom slowly faded, replaced by something else: respect. The prosecutor, still in shock, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, in light of these revelations, I move to dismiss all charges." The substitute judge, who had been hastily called in, nodded without hesitation. Case dismissed. The gavel struck, but this time it wasn't a symbol of mockery. It was justice finally being served. Eleanor stood, gathering her worn shawl over her shoulders. As she turned to leave, the man in the dark suit stepped beside her. "You could come back, you know," he said quietly. "The law still needs people like you." She gave a small smile. "Maybe," she replied, "but for now, I think I've made my point." As she walked out, the courtroom remained silent, watching her go. No longer an old woman to be mocked, but a legend who had just reminded them all what true justice looked like. The sun hung low over the quiet countryside as a group of gang members rolled up to an old farm, laughing and jeering. They thought it was just another easy target, an aging, disabled farmer living alone, an easy mark for their intimidation. They mocked him, pushed him around, and threatened to take what little he had left. But what they didn't know was that this man wasn't just any farmer. He had a past, one soaked in blood and built on survival. He had walked through fire and come out the other side, harder than they could ever imagine. At first he played along, acting weak, letting them think they were in control. But as the insults turned to threats, something in his eyes changed. The gang had no idea they had just made the worst mistake of their lives. Because once this farmer decided to fight back, there was no stopping him. The leader of the gang, a cocky young man with a scar across his cheek, stepped closer, smirking as he grabbed the farmer's collar. "You're gonna hand over whatever cash you got, old man," he sneered. The others laughed, circling like vultures, ready to tear apart anything left. But the farmer didn't flinch. He simply looked up, his weathered face unreadable, his hands steady despite their threats. He had seen worse, much worse. The gang assumed his silence was fear, but in reality, he was remembering. The things he had done, the men he had taken down, the years he spent in a world far darker than any of them could imagine. They had no clue who they were messing with. Then, as one of them reached for his pocket, the farmer sighed, almost disappointed. They had made their choice, and soon they would regret ever setting foot on his land. The gang's laughter echoed across the empty fields, but the farmer remained still, his eyes locked on the leader. Something about his stare made the younger man hesitate for just a second, but pride kept him moving forward. "You deaf, old man," he taunted, shoving the farmer back a step. The others followed his lead, kicking at the dust, grinning like they had already won. The farmer exhaled slowly. His hands, rough from years of work, curled into fists at his sides. He had left his past behind for a reason, buried it deep beneath the quiet life he built here. But trouble had a way of finding him, no matter how far he ran. From the barn, a shadow shifted. A single breath of movement, barely noticeable. But the farmer saw it, and he knew he wasn't alone in this fight. The gang thought they had him cornered, but they had no idea what was coming. The leader of the gang cracked his knuckles, his patience wearing thin. "Last chance, old man," he warned, pulling out a small blade and twirling it between his fingers. The others closed in, their confidence unshaken. To them, this was just another job: scare the weak, take what they wanted, and leave without a